The town of Hollow Creek lay quiet that morning, save for the gossip that spread faster than wildfire. The streets were still damp from last night's rain, and the scent of wet earth clung to the air. Shopkeepers opened their doors. Children ran barefoot through the puddles, and the church bell tolled in the distance a sound that usually marked peace. But on this day, it rang heavy, like a warning. Clara Morgan felt the weight of those tolls as she stepped out of her cabin at the edge of town. Her home was a humble one built of rough pine logs, with herbs hanging from the rafters and rows of dried plants tied neatly along the walls. For years she had lived quietly, healing the sick, mending wounds, and easing mothers through childbirth. She had never asked for payment beyond what folks could spare: a loaf of bread, a quilt, sometimes just a smile of gratitude. But gratitude was fleeting in Hollow Creek. Fear, however, lingered long. It began 3 nights ago when little Anna, the blacksmith's daughter, took ill. Her fever burned so high that even the town doctor had shaken his head and said nothing could be done. In desperation, Anna Mae's mother had come pounding on Clara's door. Clara had brewed a tea from willow bark and feverfew, cooled the girl's forehead with soaked linens, and whispered prayers into the night. By dawn, Anna Mae's fever broke, her breathing eased, and her color returned. Instead of thanks, Clara was met with suspicion. Too fast, the townsfolk muttered. No natural cure works like that. She must have called on the devil. Only witches meddle with life and death. By the second day, the whispers turned into accusations. By the third, the preacher himself called a gathering in the square. Clara had tried to walk through town that morning with her basket of herbs, her chin held high despite the stares. Women pulled their children close. Men turned away or spat on the ground. It was as though overnight she had gone from healer to monster. When the sheriff approached her outside the general store, the crowd swelled. He was a broad-shouldered man with eyes that avoided hers. "Clara Morgan," he said, voice rough, "by order of the council, you're to stand accused of witchcraft." Gasps rose from the crowd. Clara's heart thudded in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. "Witchcraft? You know better than that, Sheriff. I've done nothing but help this town for years." "That's not for me to say," he replied, though his hand tightened on her arm as though afraid she might curse him. "It's for the preacher and the council to decide." The townsfolk jeered as she was marched to the church. Some called her a liar. Others shouted that she had bewitched the children with her herbs. An old man waved his cane, hollering that his cow had died after Clara walked past his pasture last week. Every petty grievance became a stone thrown at her name. Inside the church, the air was heavy with the smell of oil lamps and damp wood. The preacher, tall and gaunt, with a face sharp as a hawk's beak, stood before her. His voice carried like thunder. "Clara Morgan, you stand accused of sorcery, of working with dark powers to deceive the people of this town. You have corrupted our children, defied the Lord's natural law, and endangered our souls. How do you plead?" Clara met his piercing gaze, her hands trembling only slightly. "I plead guilty only to healing, to caring for those you would let die. If knowledge makes me guilty, then I'll not apologize for it." Her defiance sparked an uproar. The preacher raised his arms, calling for silence. "This is the devil's tongue speaking through her. Do you not hear it? She mocks righteousness, just as the serpent mocked Eve in the garden. The evidence is clear, her hands bring life where the Lord has decreed death. Such power does not come from heaven." The crowd roared its agreement. Clara's chest tightened. She wanted to cry, to beg them to see reason, but she knew it would be useless. These were her neighbors, people she had nursed and comforted, and now their eyes were filled with hatred. The preacher's words struck the final blow. "Tomorrow, at dawn, we will cleanse this town of her corruption. Clara Morgan shall hang by the neck until her soul is purged." The church echoed with cheers and amen. Clara stood frozen as the sheriff bound her wrists with coarse rope. She caught sight of Anna Mae's mother in the crowd, tears streaming down her cheeks. But the woman said nothing, only lowered her gaze as she was led out into the night air. Clara's heart pounded with disbelief. She had saved a child's life, and now hers would be taken in return. Hollow Creek had spoken. The gallows awaited her. The jailhouse was nothing more than a one-room shack beside the sheriff's office. Its bars rusted and its floor littered with straw that smelled faintly of old sweat and spilled whiskey. Clara sat on the hard bench, wrists still bound, her heart thudding like a drum in her chest. The night air crept in through the cracks in the wooden walls, carrying the sound of murmuring voices outside. The town wasn't sleeping. They were waiting, waiting for dawn, waiting for her death. The sheriff had said little as he pushed her into the cell. He avoided her eyes, as though the simple act of looking at her might draw down the devil's curse. Clara watched him pace once, twice, then finally settle at his desk, head bowed as though weighed down by the burden of the preacher's words. For a brief moment, Clara wondered if he doubted the sentence, but fear had a way of making men weak. She tried speaking to him. "Sheriff," she said softly, "you've seen me tend the sick. You know I've never brought harm to anyone." His jaw tightened, but he didn't lift his gaze. "Clara," he muttered, "sometimes harm ain't in the doing. Sometimes it's in what folks believe." She closed her eyes, swallowing the lump in her throat. Belief, lies, rumors, and fear held more weight than truth in Hollow Creek. The hours dragged on. At one point, a stone clattered against the window bars, followed by a child's voice shouting, which another round of laughter and scuffling feet. Clara pressed her hands to her ears and tried not to cry. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her broken. When the church bell tolled midnight, the door creaked open. The preacher stepped inside, his shadow long and spindly against the wall. His black coat swayed like wings as he approached. The bars, have you prayed for forgiveness, Clara Morgan? His voice was low, sharp as a blade. I've nothing to beg forgiveness for, she answered, lifting her chin. His eyes narrowed, catching the lantern light like cold steel. Defiance. To the end, the devil holds your tongue, but he will not hold your soul when it dangles before the Lord tomorrow. Clara's hands curled into fists. If the Lord gave me knowledge to heal, would he not want me to use it? You twist his word to suit your fear. The preacher sneered. You call it knowledge, but I call it heresy. You brought back the blacksmith's child when death had already claimed her. That is no gift of heaven, it is rebellion against it. Her voice cracked, though her spirit burned bright. I saved her life. You defied God's will. His words fell like a gavel. And for that, you will hang. With that, he turned and left, his boots echoing against the wooden floor. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably, but still said nothing. Clara stared at the door long after it closed, her chest heaving with anger and sorrow. By morning, the town square was a storm of voices. Clara was dragged from her cell, wrists still bound, her feet stumbling against the dirt road as the sheriff led her forward. Men, women, and children lined the way, their faces twisted with excitement, fear, or grim satisfaction. Some spat at her as she passed. Others clutched their Bibles, whispering prayers to ward off her darkness. At the gallows, the preacher stood tall, arms lifted high. Brothers and sisters, he called out, today we cleanse Hollow Creek of wickedness. Today we free ourselves from the grasp of evil. The crowd cheered, a roar of approval. Clara felt her stomach twist. Was this the same town she had once loved? The same people who had once trusted her? She was forced to stand on the wooden platform, the noose dangling above like a serpent waiting to strike. The rope's coarse fibers brushed her cheek as the executioner adjusted it. Her heart pounded, but she refused to tremble. The preacher's voice rose. Let this be a lesson to Alcyn, will not take root in this soil. The townsfolk shouted their agreement, fists raised. Clara's gaze swept over the crowd, searching desperately for a single kind face. She found none. Even own family stood silent, their eyes lowered. In that moment, Clara understood. She was already dead to them. The sheriff stood to one side, his lips pressed thin, his eyes avoiding hers. The lever that would release the trapdoor stood inches from his hand. She wondered if he, too, had convinced himself that this was justice or if he simply feared being condemned himself. As the preacher gave the signal to begin the prayer of condemnation, Clara lifted her head to the sky. She whispered under her breath, not for them but for herself. If there is a God, let him see the truth. And if he will not save me, then may he give me strength to face this. The rope was lowered around her neck. The crowd fell into silence. Tomorrow's dawn would bring her end. But even as the sun began to rise on the horizon, a dust cloud gathered far down the road, a lone rider coming fast. Black Hat pulled low, his presence a storm in the making. People of Hollow Creek did not yet know it, but the trial they had staged would soon be interrupted, and Clara Morgan's fate was not yet sealed. The rope still hung loose around Clara's neck when the preacher raised his hand for silence. A prayer was forming on his lips when the sound of hooves split the air sharp, steady, and fast. The crowd turned as one, squinting against the rising sun. A lone rider emerged from the dust, his black hat pulled low, his coat long and dark as midnight. The horse beneath him was a beast of muscle and power, hooves striking the dirt like thunder. Every beat echoed in the stillness, louder and louder until the man reined his mount at the edge of the square. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Even without his name spoken, they knew him. Cole, someone whispered. Jackson Cole. The name carried weight like a curse. Mothers pulled their children close. Men shifted uneasily, and the preacher's jaw clenched tight. Stories about Jackson Cole had traveled farther than any wagon trail. Some claimed he was a merciless killer who could shoot a man through the eye before he even drew his pistol. Others swore he had once wiped out an entire gang single-handedly. A few whispered that the devil himself kept him alive, for no bullet had ever struck him down, but none dared speak too loudly. Jackson swung down from his horse, dust rolling off his boots. His presence was enough to part the crowd without a word. Dark stubble shadowed his jaw, and his eyes cold gray as gunmetal swept over the gallows. He did not flinch at the sight of Clara bound with the noose around her neck. Instead, he lit a match, brought it to a cigarette between his lips, and drew slow. The preacher cleared his throat, raising his voice. This is God's justice, Cole. Best you turn around and ride back the way you came. Jackson blew out smoke, his gaze never leaving Clara. Funny, he drawled, his voice rough and calm all at once. "But from where I stand, it looks a lot like fear, dressed up in Sunday clothes." The crowd murmured, uneasy. The preacher's face flushed with anger. "You will not interfere in the will of this town. She is a witch, she must hang." "Witch?" Jackson finally looked at him, slow and deliberate. "I've seen witches in my time, black-eyed killers who carved runes into flesh, men who sold their souls for a sack of gold. That woman," his head tilted toward Clara, "she's no witch, she's just unlucky enough to be smarter than the rest of you." A ripple of shock ran through the people. Clara's heart lurched. This stranger, this feared gunslinger, was defending her? She had never seen him before, never even heard his voice, yet he stood like a wall between her and death. The preacher's lips thinned into a tight line. "She meddles in things no decent woman should. Healing the dying, reviving what God has taken." Jackson cut him off with a sharp laugh, the kind that made men shift nervously. "So that's the crime. She saved a child's life, and you want to string her up for it. Hell, preacher, maybe you ought to hang the blacksmith too, for hammering steel the good Lord never put in the ground." A few men chuckled despite themselves, quickly silenced by the preacher's glare. Clara's pulse hammered in her ears. She wanted to shout, to plead, but her throat was tight. The sheriff stood by, his hand near his pistol, torn between duty to the preacher and the terror of facing Jackson Cole. The gunslinger stepped closer to the gallows, boots thudding on the wooden boards. His eyes locked on Clara's. She saw something, their hardness, yes, but also a flicker of something else. Recognition, perhaps, or memory. He turned back to the preacher. "Take the rope off her neck." The preacher shook his head, defiance flickering in his eyes. "You can't come here, outlaw, and tell us how to keep our town clean. We answer to God, not to you." Jackson's hand rested on the butt of his revolver. His voice was low, dangerous. "I don't recall asking." The silence was so heavy, it could crush a man. The crowd watched with wide eyes, torn between loyalty to their preacher and the raw fear of the man before them. Jackson Cole was not one to bluff, and everyone knew it. Finally, the sheriff swallowed hard, sweat trickling down his brow. "Preacher," he muttered, "maybe best we know." The preacher barked, "This is our trial, our town. We will not bow to an outlaw." Jackson's eyes narrowed. He took one slow step forward, then another, the boards creaking beneath his weight. The crowd seemed to shrink back, the world holding its breath. Clara's heart raced as she realized the standoff could break into bloodshed at any second. The preacher raised his Bible like a shield. "The devil sends you here to protect her." Jackson smirked, though his gaze was sharp as a blade. "Maybe, or maybe I just don't like seeing good women hanged by cowards hiding behind holy words." The preacher's face turned crimson, but for the first time, Clara saw the flicker of doubt in the man's eyes. And in that moment, she knew. Her trial was no longer in the preacher's hands. It now belonged to the gunslinger. The gallows remained standing in the square, silent and looming, but Clara was not left upon it. After Jackson Cole's interruption, the preacher, red-faced and trembling with fury, demanded that she be taken back to the jail until this meddling outlaw is driven out of town. The sheriff obeyed with visible relief, leading Clara through the throng. The crowd parted reluctantly, their eyes filled with both hatred for her and unease at the gunslinger who now leaned against the post of the saloon, smoking as though the entire town were no more than a stage for his amusement. Clara caught a glimpse of him through the shifting bodies, his gray eyes, tracking her every step. Unreadable, cold and sharp, by the time the cell door clanged shut behind her once more. The weight of the day pressed down so heavily she thought her chest might break. Her wrists ached from the ropes, her throat burned where the noose had scraped her skin, and her body trembled with exhaustion. But worse than all of it was the sound outside, voices muttering, laughter drifting, and sometimes jeers thrown toward her window, which rot in hell. She hang at sunrise, outlaw or not. Clara pressed her back to the wall, drawing her knees close, willing herself not to cry. She would not give them the satisfaction. Yet inside, her spirit wavered. She had faced sickness, death, and pain before, but never this, never the betrayal of every face she thought familiar. When the night deepened and the moon rose, the sheriff dozed in his chair, his hat tipped low. Clara sat awake, staring through the iron bars at the thin slice of sky. The stars looked cold, distant, untouched by the cruelty below. It was then that the door opened with a creak, the hinges groaned, and heavy boots stepped inside. Clara's heart seized. She expected the preacher again, come to gloat, but it was not him. Jackson Cole stood in the lantern light, broad-shouldered and still as stone. The sheriff jerked upright, reaching for his revolver, but Jackson's gaze silenced him. Without drawing a weapon, the gunslinger carried a weight that made men hesitate. "What are you doing here?" the sheriff asked, his voice tight. Jackson struck a match, lit another cigarette, and leaned casually against the wall. "Checking on your prisoner." "She's not mine," the sheriff muttered. "She belongs to the council. She's a woman, not property." Jackson replied, smoke curling around his words. "And if you had a spine, you'd admit you know she doesn't belong on that rope." The sheriff's jaw worked, but he said nothing. He turned his gaze away, back to his desk, and busied himself with papers that didn't need shuffling. Jackson's eyes shifted to Clara, holding her in their steel-gray grip. "You look like hell." Her lips parted, caught off guard. Of all the things he might have said, that was not what she expected. "I suppose that's fitting," she murmured. "That's where they say I belong." The corner of his mouth twitched not quite a smile. "You believe that?" "No," she lifted her chin. "But it seems belief doesn't matter in this town." A silence stretched between them. Clara studied him. This feared outlaw, this man whose name carried the scent of blood. Why had he spoken for her? Why had he risked angering the town? "Why?" she asked softly. "Why did you stop them?" He drew slow on his cigarette, the ember glowing in the dim light. "Let's just say I've seen too many ropes tied for the wrong neck." Clara's breath caught. There was something in his voice, a shadow of memory, of loss that struck deep. He didn't explain, and she didn't press, but she felt the weight of his words settle into her heart. When he finally turned to leave, Clara almost called after him. She wanted to ask if he truly believed she was innocent, if he would return when the sun rose. But the words stayed locked in her throat. The door shut behind him, leaving her in darkness once more. That night, sleep came only in broken fragments. She dreamed of ropes tightening, of faces twisted with hatred, of fire consuming her little cabin with all her herbs and books. She dreamed of running barefoot through the woods, chased by shadows that whispered her name. And always, in the edge of those dreams, the gunslinger appeared, his gray eyes watching, his presence both terrifying and strangely steadying. When dawn's first light crept into the cell, Clara's body was heavy with weariness. The townsfolk were already gathering, their voices carrying through the morning air. The gallows waited. The preacher's voice carried on the wind, promising that this would be the day evil was vanquished. Clara pressed her palms together, whispering a prayer not for rescue, but for courage. She did not yet know that Jackson Cole had not ridden out of town that night. He had stayed, and when the rope was tightened once more around her neck, the town of Hollow Creek would learn that their trial was far from finished. The sun crept over Hollow Creek like a blade of fire, casting long shadows across the town square. Already, the people had gathered in anticipation. Men leaned on rifles, women clutched their children close, and the preacher stood at the gallows, Bible raised high, his voice booming with scripture. Clara was led from the jail, wrists bound, her steps heavy. Her body trembled, but her head remained lifted. She would not bow, even if this was her last walk. Every face she passed told her the same story: fear, hatred, and a strange, twisted eagerness for blood. Hollow Creek was hungry for a spectacle, eager to see the witch purged so they could sleep soundly at night, believing they had conquered evil. The sheriff marched beside her, silent as stone. He had avoided her eyes since the day before, and she could see the sweat beading on his brow. He was a man torn, but not torn enough to save her. The gallows loomed. Clara mounted the steps, her heart hammering, the noose dangling above her like a serpent ready to strike. The preacher lifted his arms, the crowd fell silent, and the rope was lowered around her neck once more. "Brothers and sisters," the preacher intoned, "we stand before the Lord today to cast out the devil's servant from our midst. Evil has no place here today. Righteousness will triumph." A roar of approval answered him. Clara closed her eyes. She whispered a final prayer for strength. Suddenly, the sound of hooves shattered the square. The crowd turned as dust rose from the street. A lone rider approached, just as he had the day before, but this time, he did not stop at the edge of town. Jackson Cole rode straight into the heart of the square, his horse snorting, iron shoes striking sparks against the stones. Gasps rippled through the people. Mothers pulled their children back. Men shifted nervously, hands hovering near weapons. Jackson dismounted in one smooth motion. He tied his reins loosely to the post of the gallows and walked forward, his boots heavy on the wood planks. The morning sun lit his weathered face, his gray eyes glinting like steel. His revolver rested easy at his hip, but his presence alone was a weapon sharper than any blade. He stopped at the foot of the platform, his gaze locked on Clara. For a moment, the crowd vanished, the preacher, the townsfolk, the sheriff, all of them. In that silent exchange, Clara saw something she had not expected, not pity, but a kind of promise. Then he turned his gaze on the preacher. "You're making a mistake," Jackson said, his voice low and steady. The preacher bristled. "You again. This is not your concern, outlaw. Be gone before you share her fate." Jackson let out a short, humorless laugh. "Her fate? You mean the one you and your flock dreamed up to keep your fear quiet at night?" His eyes swept over the crowd. "I've seen a lot of towns in my time. Some fall to sickness, some to outlaws, some to fire. But this," he jabbed a finger toward Clara, "this is worse. You're letting lies and cowardice kill your own." Murmurs spread through the people. The preacher's face turned crimson. "She is a witch. She defies the Lord's will, playing with life and death. She's a healer," Jackson snapped. "She saved a child's life, and for that, you'd string her up." The crowd stirred, voices rising. Some muttered agreement, others shouted for her death. The sheriff shifted uneasily at the preacher's side. Clara's chest tightened. Was the tide turning, or was the mob too far gone? The preacher raised his Bible high. You dare defy the will of God, gunslinger. You dare protect a woman of sin. Jackson's hand dropped to his revolver. His thumb, brushing the worn handle, his voice turned cold as ice. I don't give a damn about your sermons. I care about justice, and if you want her dead, you'll have to go through me. The square went deathly still. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. The preacher faltered, his eyes darting to the sheriff, then to the crowd. He had not expected such bold defiance, not from a man whose name alone could silence taverns. Clara's throat tightened as she watched Jackson. Why was he doing this? Why risk his life for her, a stranger? The preacher's words from the night before echoed in her mind. The devil sends you here to protect her. Was that true? Or was this outlaw something else, entirely a man haunted by his own demons, fighting hers as if they were his own? The preacher's voice cracked, but he forced strength into it. Sheriff sees him. The sheriff froze. His eyes darted from the preacher to Jackson, then to Clara. His hand hovered near his weapon, trembling, and Jackson Cole stood calm as a storm, his revolver still holstered, but his presence radiating danger. He looked at the sheriff, his voice, low enough for only the front rows to hear. You draw that iron, sheriff, and you won't live to regret it. The sheriff swallowed, his hand falling away. The crowd gasped, stunned at his refusal to act. The preacher's fury twisted his face, but Jackson only took a slow step onto the gallows platform, his boots thudding against the wood. He stopped beside Clara, his shadow falling over her. Take the rope off her neck, he said again, his voice calm but unyielding. Now, the preacher's hand shook. For the first time, his authority wavered. The crowd whispered, uncertain, and Clara, her breath caught in her chest, realized that this was no passing interference. Jackson Cole had chosen a side hearse, and Hollow Creek would never be the same again. The square of Hollow Creek turned into a battlefield of wills the moment Jackson Cole put himself between Clara and the noose. The gallows creaked under their weight, the rope biting into Clara's neck, but what silenced the crowd was not her suffering, it was the gunslinger's steady hand resting on the grip of his revolver. The preacher thundered from below, Bible held high. His voice, usually unshakable, cracked with fury as he cried out that Jackson was the devil's servant, shielding a witch from righteous judgment. That word which still stirred fear among the people. But Jackson's presence twisted the air with something stronger, hesitation. Call her what you like, Jackson said, his voice carrying across the square, cold and cutting, but don't call this justice. Some townsfolk shifted uneasily, eyes darting between their preacher and the man they all feared. A few shouted for blood, their voices trembling more from fear than conviction. Others fell silent, troubled by the truth behind Jackson's words. Clara's chest ached under the noose, yet for the first time since her arrest, she felt something flicker inside her hope. The preacher demanded the sheriff act, but the lawman's hand hovered uselessly near his pistol. Everyone knew Jackson Cole's reputation. To draw against him was suicide. The sheriff lowered his hand, shamefaced, and the crowd murmured at his cowardice. Jackson seized the moment. You're all so eager to see her hang, but what's her crime? Saving a child. Healing with knowledge you don't understand. If that's wickedness, then the real sin lies in your hearts, not hers. His words cut deep, though they did not heal all. Some faces softened with doubt, but others twisted harder in anger. Fear clung to them, and fear is not so easily erased. The preacher, realizing his grip was slipping, lashed out with venom. He painted Jackson as a murderer, a blood outlaw who only brought ruin wherever he went. And there was truth in that. Jackson's past was written in lead and ashbutt here. In this moment, he stood as Clara's shield. The standoff thickened, the crowd teetering on the edge of violence. Clara's heart raced, knowing a single spark could unleash bloodshed. Then Jackson cocked back the hammer of his revolver. The sound cracked across the square like lightning. Silence fell instantly. Even the bravest men dared not move. Nobody touches her, he warned. The preacher's fury burned hotter, but he could not command his flock forward. He spat a curse instead, damning both Clara and the gunslinger. Take her then. Run like the hunted beasts you are. But no, this we will not forget. The Lord's judgment will find you both. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the people, but the courage to act had drained from them. With steady hands, Jackson reached up and tugged the rope free from Clara's neck. The coarse fibers scraped her skin as they fell away, leaving her raw but alive. She gasped a full breath, dizzy with relief. Jackson's eyes met hers briefly, and for all his reputation as a man of iron, there was something steady and reassuring in his gaze. Time to leave, he said simply. Clara's legs trembled, but she followed him down from the gallows. The crowd parted in silence, hatred still simmering in their eyes, but none dared raise a hand. Not with Jackson Cole leading her away. It was not a victory, not yet. The town's fury had only been delayed, but for Clara, With the rope gone from her neck and a gunslinger at her side, it felt like the first breath of freedom. Night settled over the hills, painting the rugged landscape in silver and shadow. The horse had carried them for hours through narrow gullies, across dry creek beds, and up into the jagged wilderness where the air grew cooler and the stars burned brighter. By the time Jackson finally slowed and chose a hidden hollow tucked between two ridges, Clara was so exhausted she could barely hold herself upright. "This'll do," he said quietly, sliding down from the saddle. He tied the horse beneath an outcrop where it would be concealed, then reached up to help Clara dismount. Her legs gave way when her boots touched the ground, and she stumbled. His arm shot out, catching her before she could fall. "Easy there," he murmured. She flushed with embarrassment but allowed him to steady her. Her body was trembling from more than just fatigue. Her mind still reeled from the day's horrors, from the gallows, the crowd's jeers, and the gunfire ringing in her ears. Yet here, in the quiet of the hills, she could finally breathe. Jackson gathered wood and coaxed a small fire to life, its orange glow pushing back the dark. The warmth licked against Clara's chilled skin, and for the first time in days, she felt something close to comfort. She sat on a flat stone, watching Jackson move with the efficiency of a man who had survived many such nights in the wild. "You've done this before," she said softly. His mouth twitched into a faint smile as he lowered himself to the fire. "More times than I can count. Ain't much about sleeping under the stars, I don't know." Clara hesitated, then asked, "Were you always a gunslinger?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he tossed another stick into the flames and watched it crackle. Finally he said, "No, I wasn't born with a gun in my hand, if that's what you're asking. I had a family once, a little farm out west, near the border. Good land, good soil. Thought I'd grow old there." Clara's heart ached at the roughness in his voice. "What happened?" His jaw clenched. The firelight caught the hard planes of his face, deepening the shadows in his eyes. "Outlaws rode through. Burned it all. Took my wife and son from me." He paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "I hunted those men down, one by one. After that, I reckon the world only ever saw me as a killer." The silence stretched, heavy with sorrow. Clara's throat tightened. "I'm so sorry, Jackson." He shrugged, but the pain lingered in his gaze. "Don't be. Nothing to be done about it now, just ghosts that follow me." Clara drew her knees close, staring into the fire. She wanted to tell him her story, to how her mother had taught her herbs and remedies, how she had only ever tried to heal, not harm, and how that kindness had been twisted into witchcraft by people who feared what they didn't understand. Instead, she whispered, "I know what it is to be hated for something you never meant to be." That made him look at her, really look. His blue-gray eyes softened, the sharpness easing for the first time since she had met him. "They don't deserve you, Clara, not one of them." Her chest tightened at his words. It had been so long since anyone spoke to her with kindness. She felt tears burn her eyes, though she tried to blink them back. Jackson noticed. He leaned slightly closer, his voice gentler. "You're stronger than you think. I saw it, back there. On that scaffold most folk would have broken. But you," he shook his head. "You stood tall, even with a rope round your neck." Clara swallowed hard. "I thought I was going to die." "You didn't," he said firmly. "And I'll make damn sure you don't." The words hung between them, fierce and unshakable. Clara's heart gave a strange, trembling leap. For so long she had been alone, abandoned by everyone she had trusted. And now here was this feared man, pledging his protection with a conviction that left her breathless. They sat in silence after that, the fire crackling softly. Above them, the stars stretched endless, bright and cold. For Clara, the night no longer felt like a cage, but a promise that maybe survival wasn't impossible, that maybe she wasn't destined only for fear and pain. Jackson leaned back against a rock, his revolvers within reach, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the fire's glow. "Get some rest," he said. "We've got a long ride ahead come morning." Clara lay down near the fire, wrapping her arms around herself. Sleep didn't come. Easily her mind still swirled with fear of the preacher, of the posse that might still be hunting them, but each time her eyes fluttered open, she saw Jackson there, vigilant, watchful, like a sentinel carved from stone. And, slowly, under the blanket of stars, Clara let herself believe she might live to see another dawn. Dawn crept across the ridges, spilling gold and rose over the wilderness. Clara woke to the sound of horses, distant at first, then nearer, echoing between the cliffs. She sat up quickly, heart hammering, and found Jackson already on his feet. Revolvers strapped, eyes narrowed at the horizon. "They've found us," he said grimly. Clara's breath caught. The preacher had sworn he wouldn't rest until she swung from a rope, and it seemed he had made good on that vow. Dust trails wound through the canyon below, at least a dozen riders pushing hard. "We can't outrun them?" she asked. Jackson shook his head. "Not in this country. We make our stand here." Clara's stomach nodded, but she rose, drawing closer to him. There was no fear in his voice, only certainty. It steadied her, though dread still coiled inside. "Then, we fight." Jackson glanced at her, a spark of respect flickering in his hardened gaze. You got more grit than most men I've known." They moved quickly, taking cover among the rocks that rimmed the hollow. Jackson showed her how to load extra cartridges into his spare revolver, though her hands trembled as she touched the cold steel. "You won't need to fire," he told her firmly. "Just stay low. Let me do the rest." The posse thundered into view. Minutes later, faces twisted with rage, rifles gleaming in the rising sun. At their head rode the preacher, his black coat flapping like a crow's wings, eyes burning with righteous fury. "There she is," he shouted, pointing at Clara, "the witch and her devil." Gunfire split the morning. Jackson was faster, his pistols barked, and 2 riders toppled before they could even raise their rifles. Horses screamed, dust exploded, men cursed. The posse faltered, unused to such merciless precision. Clara crouched low, covering her ears as bullets wind off the rocks. Jackson moved like a shadow, ducking, firing, reloading, in fluid rhythm. He wasn't just a gunslinger, he was a storm unleashed. The preacher rallied his men, spitting venom. "Do not falter. God is with us. Strike them down." Another rider charged forward, and Clara cried out as he leveled his shotgun at Jackson's back. Without thinking, she snatched up a stone and hurled it with all her strength. It struck the horse's flank, making it rear. The shotgun blast went wide. Jackson spun, returned fire, and the rider fell. He looked back at her, surprise flashing across his face. Then, a sharp grin, not bad, which her heart pounded, but she managed a breathless laugh. One by one, the posse began to break. Some turned their mounts and fled, unwilling to face death for the preacher's cause. But the preacher himself remained, rage twisting his features. He spurred his horse forward, shouting curses, a rifle clenched in his hands. "This ends now," he roared. Jackson stepped into the open, calm as a stone. "You want her, preacher? You'll have to go through me." The 2 men faced each other in the dusty hollow, dawn burning bright behind them. Time seemed to stop, the world shrinking to the space between their eyes. Their guns, their breath. The preacher's hand twitched. Jackson's guns flared. When the smoke cleared, the preacher lay sprawled in the dirt, his rifle clattering from lifeless fingers. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the wind sighing through the rocks. Clara slowly rose from her cover, her body trembling. She looked at Jackson, at the man who had defied a whole town for her, and felt her throat tighten. "It's over," she whispered. He holstered his pistols, eyes never leaving hers. "It's over." The last of the riders fled, leaving the hollow littered with dust and echoes. Clara stepped closer, her hand brushing Jackson's arm. She wanted to thank him, to say something more than words could carry, but emotion choked her. He studied her face, softer now than she'd ever seen it. "You're free, Clara. No rope, no crowd. You get to choose what comes next." Tears welled in her eyes, not of fear this time, but of release. For so long she had lived under suspicion, whispered about, condemned for gifts she never asked for. And now, standing in the dawn with Jackson beside her, she felt the weight finally lift. "I don't know where to go," she admitted. His smile was faint, tired, but true. "Then we'll find some place together. Someplace they don't call you a witch. Someplace where we both get a new start." For the first time in years, hope stirred in her chest. She nodded, her voice firm. "Yes, together." They saddled the horse and rode out of the hollow, leaving the preacher's shadow behind. The land stretched wide and endless before them, bathed in morning light. Clara leaned into Jackson's steady presence, her heart beating with a strange new certainty. Whatever waited beyond the horizon, redemption, danger, or peace, they would face it side by side. No longer outcasts, no longer alone. And as the sun climbed higher, the gunslinger and the woman once called a witch disappeared into the open sky, bound not by fear but by the promise of a new beginning. The dawn of Clara's execution rose with a cruel stillness, the sky painted in soft pinks and golds that mocked the dread in her chest. The gallows stood in the town square like a monster waiting for its prey, the noose swaying gently in the morning breeze. Townsfolk gathered early, whispering and jeering, their eyes sharp with judgment. Some came for spectacle, others for vengeance, and still others because they were too afraid not to. Clara's wrists were bound tightly, her steps heavy as the sheriff and 2 deputies marched her forward. Her throat was dry, her mind racing. She thought of her mother's teachings, the remedies she had used to heal, the small kindnesses she had offered, yet all of it had been twisted into something ugly. They called her a witch because they could not understand her. The preacher stood tall at the foot of the gallows, Bible in hand, declaring that justice would be served today. His words dripped with righteous fury, but Clara felt only hollow despair. She searched the crowd, desperate for any sign of Jackson Cole, though she knew the townsfolk believed him gone. The night before, they had barred the saloon doors and doubled the watch. Whispers said even the gunslinger would not dare defy the Lord's will. The rope was lowered over her neck, coarse fibers scraping her skin. The executioner tightened it and stepped aside. The crowd hushed, anticipation thick in the air. Clara closed her eyes, preparing herself for the drop. for the sudden snap that would end her life, and then a single gunshot cracked through the silence. The rope above her head split clean, the noose falling slack against her shoulders. Gasps erupted, and Clara's eyes flew open in shock. Smoke curled from a revolver barrel at the far edge of the square. There he was, Jackson Cole, hat pulled low, eyes burning like steel. He strode forward with the calm of a man who owned the ground beneath him. "Step away from her," Jackson ordered, his voice carrying across the square. The sheriff cursed under his breath, fumbling for his gun, but Jackson's revolver swung toward him in a flash. "Don't," Jackson warned, and the sheriff froze, sweat dripping down his temple. The deputies, too, hesitated. They had heard the stories men quicker than them had tried to outdraw Jackson Cole. None had lived to brag about it. The preacher's face flushed red with rage. "This is blasphemy. She is a witch. You would condemn your own soul for hers." Jackson's eyes narrowed. "You want her hanged because you're afraid of what you don't understand. That's not justice. That's murder." The crowd rippled with murmurs. Some agreed with the preacher, their fear fueling their hatred. Others looked uncertain now, shaken by Jackson's defiance. Clara stood frozen, the noose slipping from her neck completely, her chest heaving with wild relief and disbelief. The preacher shouted for the men to seize Jackson, but not a single one moved. They all knew what he was capable of. With deliberate steps, Jackson climbed the gallows. He holstered one revolver, then with his free hand pulled the rope from Clara's neck. His touch was firm but gentle, his presence a shield against the hatred of the mob. "You're free now," he murmured, low enough only she could hear. Tears blurred Clara's vision, but she forced her legs to steady. "Why?" she whispered. Jackson's eyes flickered with something hard and haunted. "Because once before, I wasn't there to stop them. Never again." Before the preacher could spit another word, Jackson turned to the crowd. "Anyone who tries to follow us will find themselves 6 feet under. You all hear me." His voice was death itself, and the silence that followed was answer enough. Gripping Clara's arm, Jackson led her down from the gallows. The crowd parted reluctantly, hatred burning in their eyes, but no one brave or foolish enough to stand in his way. Clara's legs trembled, but she walked, her heart hammering as though it might burst. Once they reached the edge of the square, Jackson gave a sharp whistle. His black horse emerged from the shadows of the alley, obedient and powerful. He swung into the saddle with practiced ease, then reached down to lift Clara up behind him. "Hold on," he said simply. Clara wrapped her arms around him, clutching desperately as he spurred the horse into a gallop. Dust kicked up behind them as they tore down the road, leaving Hollow Creek in chaos. The preacher's shouts faded into the distance, but his vow of vengeance lingered in Clara's mind. As the town shrank on the horizon, Clara pressed her face against Jackson's back, breathing in the leather and gunpowder that clung to him. She was alive, saved by the very man they called a killer. The noose had not claimed her. Instead, fate had given her a chance, and bound her path to the feared gunslinger who had chosen her side. The sound of thundering hooves echoed down the dusty road as Jackson and Clara fled. Hollow Creek, the horse's muscles bunched and stretched beneath them, every stride carrying them farther from the gallows where Clara had nearly lost her life. She clung to him tightly, her arms wrapped around his torso, her cheek pressed against the rough fabric of his coat. Wind whipped her hair into her face, but she barely noticed. All she felt was the frantic beat of her heart and the raw terror of pursuit. Behind them, voices rose in angry shouts. The preacher's cries carried loudest of all, his words fueled by fire and hatred. "Seize them. Don't let the witch or the devil's gunman escape." Men scrambled for their horses, guns drawn, their bloodlust unquenched by Jackson's bold rescue. Jackson glanced back, his sharp eyes narrowing. A posse was forming, at least half a dozen riders already spurring hard to give chase. He muttered a curse under his breath. Figures they wouldn't let it be easy. Clara tightened her grip on him, fear searing through her veins. "They'll kill us both," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Not if I've got a say in it." Jackson's tone was calm, but Clara felt the steel beneath his words. He wasn't the kind of man who let fear steer him. The horse veered off the main road, Jackson guiding it toward the rugged hills that rose beyond the town. The terrain there was harsh rocky outcrops, narrow gullies, and thorny brush, but it was also the kind of land that could swallow a pair of fugitives whole if they knew how to use it. Jackson knew. Gunfire cracked behind them. A bullet zipped past Clara's ear, splintering a branch to their left. She flinched, letting out a strangled cry. Jackson leaned low in the saddle, urging the horse faster. "Hold tight, Clara, don't let go." They raced into the hill's hooves, striking sparks from the stone. Clara dared a glance back and saw the posse in full pursuit, faces twisted with rage, weapons glinting in the morning light. The preacher himself rode at the front, eyes burning like a zealot, as if this chase were holy war. Jackson pulled the horse into a narrow pass between two towering boulders. The walls closed in, forcing single-file pursuit. "This'll slow em some," he muttered. Clara's pulse hammered as she looked around at the jagged rocks and the shadowed gullies. "Do you really think we can escape them?" Jackson gave a short, grim smile. Darlin', escape is what I do best. At the end of the pass, he pulled the horse to a stop. Clara looked at him in shock. Why are we stopping? The bottleneck here, he said, dismounting in one smooth motion. He pulled her down gently from the saddle and pressed her against the rocks for cover. Stay low, don't move unless I tell you. Clara's hands shook as she crouched. The chill of the stone at her back, she watched as Jackson strode a few paces forward, revolvers already in his hands. His stance calm, steady like he had been born for moments just like this. The first of the posse riders burst into the pass. Jackson fired. The man's hat flew from his head as he tumbled backward off his horse. Another shot rang out, scattering the riders behind him. The rest hesitated, the echo of gunfire trapped between the cliffs. You boys really want to die for a preacher's lies, Jackson called out, his voice echoing off the stone walls. There was a pause. Clara could see it, the ripple of fear spreading through the men. They all knew Jackson's reputation. He was the fastest draw, the deadliest shot. Facing him in a tight canyon was suicide, but the preacher, red-faced and furious, raised his pistol and shouted, "Cowards, do the Lord's work." A few shots rang out, bullets sparking against the stone. Jackson ducked, returned fire, and another rider cried out, clutching his arm. The rest of the posse pulled back, retreating to regroup. Jackson exhaled slowly, one revolver, as he turned back to Clara. His eyes softened slightly at the sight of her pale face, her hands clutched to her chest. "You all right?" She nodded shakily. "I thought they'd kill you. Not today." He reached down, offering his hand. She took it, her fingers trembling in his heat, pulled her up, steadying her on her feet. For a moment, their eyes locked. Clara saw more than cold steel in his gaze. She saw weariness, grief, and a flicker of something she couldn't quite name, something that felt like hope. "We can't stay here," Jackson said, breaking the silence. "They'll circle around. We need to move deeper into the hills. I know places they won't find." Clara swallowed hard, then nodded. She trusted him, though every instinct screamed of danger. Somehow, this feared gunslinger was her only shield against a world that wanted her dead. As they mounted again and rode deeper into the wilderness, the sounds of pursuit faded behind them. But Clara knew the preacher would not give up so easily. He would follow them to the ends of the earth if he had to. Still, as she leaned against Jackson's back, feeling the solid strength of him, she felt something she hadn't since the nightmare. Began something she scarcely dared believe in. She felt safe.